Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lawrence Jones, Senior Vice President at Edison Electric Institute, International Programs, and would like to welcome you to this member-only webinar on the topic of modeling. And we'll be having a conversation today with Dr. Erica Thompson. She is a fellow based at the London School of Economics Data Science Institute. I think before I invite Erica to join us, just to set the scene here, as we know, our energy industry and the society at large is really driven by models. And from public policy, electric company leaders, everything we do is centered around models. And models actually have a big role to play in our lives. We don't think about it, but every decision that we make from a business standpoint has to do with information that's based on models. And so models are central to what we do as a world. It's very central to our industry. Everything from designing, public policy, looking at net zero goals, looking at, goals around how your business is going to run, everything from reliability, from great operations, from asset management, from investments, everything we do is centered on modeling. The issue is, can we rely 100% on these models? And so our guest today, the author of the book, Dr. Erica Thompson, Escape from Model Land, How Mathematical Models Can Lead Us Astray, and What Can We Do About It? Erica, welcome. And I think we're going to begin. You're on mute in case you we're going to begin by asking Erica to just give us a quick overview of the book to cover some of the key themes, and then we'll get into the conversation. Erica, for your knowing, the audience here is mainly EEI members, electric companies from around the world. We have people from Japan, the US, Canada, Australia, you name it. And I think we're all interested in understanding what can we do as it relates to modeling, and how can we be better users of models and better not just users, but also producers of the information that goes into models. So welcome. We'll listen to you give a quick presentation, and then we'll get into the Q&A. And to the audience, there will be time towards the end of the conversation for you to ask questions, either in the chat, or you can actually ask Erica directly. So Erica, over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Lawrence, and thank you for having me here today. I'll just try and share my screen and see if that is working. Here we go. Oh no, it's to do it. Okay, I'm going to talk without slides. That's easier. So I'll tell you a bit about me then to begin with. So my background is in maths and physics, and I did a maths degree, and then I went to do a PhD in climate change physics. And the first thing I did was a literature review, as you do when you come into this academic environment and somebody says, here's a topic, and you don't know anything about it. So I got sent to do a literature review about North Atlantic storms and what would happen to them in the context of a changing climate. And so, as we know, the information that we have about future climate comes from mathematical models. So I went away and I looked at what these models all said. There were sort of some more complex models and some simpler ones. And essentially the key takeaway after scouring through lots of papers and writing down all the information was that these models actually completely disagreed. Some of them said there were going to be more storms, some of them said there would be fewer storms, some of them said they would be more intense, some said they would be less intense, and they didn't even agree within their own error bars, right? So you had uncertainty ranges which were not even overlapping. So I think that was kind of the starting point for me of kind of realizing that actually this didn't tell me anything about North Atlantic storms, and it didn't tell me anything about climate change, but it told me a lot about the way that we go about making and constructing mathematical models and the process of making inferences from mathematical models, and perhaps a bit about how we as scientists maybe fail to think about some of the important things here. And so since then, I've spent the last 10 years or so in, looking at a variety of contexts, thinking specifically about mathematical models and how they're used to support decision making in weather and climate, that being my kind of primary background, but also in finance, insurance, humanitarian applications, and a variety of others. And so that experience over the last 10 years is what's led me to write the book, because I've realized that there are a set of kind of, very overarching problems with mathematical modeling, or, not necessarily problems, but just ways that mathematical modeling is, the limits that it has, and the way that we struggle to define what those limits are and to understand what the quality is of the information that mathematical models can actually provide for us. And so over the last, the last 3 years, we've seen an incredible case study of the use of models to support decision making playing out in real time with the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in those early days in spring 2020, when governments were acting on the basis of very limited information. We had models, quite simple epidemiological models, which had a great deal of power at the decision-making table. So, for example, the idea of flatten the curve, I'm sure everybody's familiar with that because it was all over social media in those days. That concept, that if we don't do anything, we get a big spike, and if we do take action to reduce the R number, then we can have a longer, shallower spike, and that will be less likely to overwhelm the health services, for example. And so that was an example, not just of how models are used to inform decision making, but also how models are used to sort of justify decisions, and how models are used to communicate decisions, and how models are used to sort of facilitate a collective decision making process and an understanding process. And that models can also be used in the same way to criticize decision making. You can say, actually, I've got a different model, and my model suggests that this was a bad thing because we're going to consider these other things. And with specific reference to the pandemic, we might say that the epidemiological models, with their focus on morbidity and mortality and the impact on health services, had perhaps an undue dominance in terms of the influence that they had on decision making, where because there wasn't an economic model, or there wasn't a model about mental health, or there wasn't a model about the effects on children's education of lockdowns, for example, because of not having that model, those were maybe less prioritized in the decision making kind of structures. And so I think this kind of throws in just a few of the questions that I've been thinking about over the last few years about how models are used, and how they, the mathematical side of how we put models together, how we construct models, how we calibrate models based on data, but also the social side of what it is that models actually are, and what the information means to us, and how we can integrate them into decision-making systems. And I'm sure many of that is familiar from your own context in the energy industry as well. I'm sure we could have a discussion about, how those kind of concepts translate. So in terms of the kind of key questions, the questions are sort of how do we have confidence that a model is adequate for informing the decision that we want to make? And supposing you think about your weather forecast, you get your phone out of your pocket, you look at the weather forecast. Why do you have confidence that that model, that forecast, is any good? Well, I can see the hands going up. Data, obviously, we've got data. We know it's good because it was good in the past. We have data to support our assessment of its reliability. And so there are a lot of models that are like the weather forecast in that respect, that they are kind of data-driven models, because we are, tomorrow's forecast is basically the same as yesterday's forecast, and it's not significantly different from the last 50 years of forecasts. And so we have a large archive of data which we can use to make an assessment of reliability, and which we can be confident about, minus the edge cases, minus extreme events, minus the extremes that we think climate change might be playing a part in. Everything kind of within the range of normal weather we think we can do, and we think we are confident, not necessarily that the model is perfect and that the forecast fully encapsulates what we expect to happen, but at least that we can put probabilities on it, and we expect those probabilities to be reliable probabilities. So we don't get it right every time, but we know how often we expect to get it right, and that helps us to make decisions. But of course, there are other kinds of models as well. So those data-driven models are sort of the success stories, and they are what modern life is based on, right? So the models that are underpinning the Zoom program that I'm using to talk to you now, the models that are in, all of our technology, in cars, in, everything, and the energy system. Many of those are fully data-driven models, which are based on good data, which we believe to be relevant for the purpose of understanding future performance. But then, that's what I call an interpolatory regime. That's when we are in a situation where the data that we have are relevant for the forecast we're trying to make. But what if you sort of imagine, plotting a few points in Excel and drawing a line through them? You could draw a line, you could draw a curve, you could draw a cubic, you could draw something more complicated, and all of those would be basically equally good within the domain that you're trying to interpolate. But if you think about what that's going to look like outside that domain, it goes crazy, right? You've got very different possible outcomes by fitting these different models. And so what I say is that when we're in those tails, then we are doing something more assumption driven rather than data driven. And so I want to distinguish those very clearly, because I think that, it's easy to say models are really good based on the models that are really good, and it's easy to say, oh, models are terrible based on the models that are maybe not so good or that we don't have high confidence in. But actually the question is really what it is that we're trying to do with those models, not how good is the model. You can't answer the question of how good is a model unless you say for what. You have to say for what purpose. Okay, so I think that's probably more or less enough to say now. I think we should go straight into a discussion, because I'm really excited to hear your questions, Lawrence. I know that you've read my book very thoroughly. You might be the person who's read the book most thoroughly. And
well,
so,
look, the book is the book, Escape from Model Land, is actually a very good book. And for someone in the energy field, I must say to everyone else listening who deal with this on a daily basis, really understanding the insights in the book will help you to question the veracity of the models you're using, and also how these models are being generated. So let's begin first, Erica, by going back to the title of the book, Escape from Model Land. So why this title, and why do you want us to escape from model land, and why it's important that we do it as we go forward?
Yeah, great. So escape from model land. Well, if you go away and make a model of your energy system or the weather or whatever, you go away and you write a few equations, or maybe you just write some kind of conceptual diagram of how things relate to each other on paper. Maybe you just have it in your head. Maybe you flesh it out. Maybe it's really complicated, whatever, whatever kind of model you are using. The idea of model land is kind of where you are when you are inside the boundaries of that model. So all of your assumptions are true by design. It just is what it is within the model. You can run your simulation forward, you can make a prediction, and it will be, you're making a prediction of what the model is going to do. So that's right, again, by definition, because you're just running a model forward. But nobody cares. Nobody wants to know. Nobody has any interest in your model until you make a claim that what the model is doing is in some way relevant or related to the real world, because we live in the real world. We don't care about model land. We live in the real world, and we're trying to make decisions about the real world. So the idea of escaping from model land is saying it's not enough just to kind of make a model and then kind of very fuzzily sort of claim that it has something to do with reality because it looks quite good or it draws the right kind of picture. We have to be specific, and we have to be quantitative about the degree to which that model is actually reflective of what will happen in the real world. And that's a difficult question, right? If you have data, then you can go back to the data and you can probably do that. If you don't have data, or if you're in this extrapolatory regime where actually the data that you have referred to a different set of circumstances, then you're going to have a really difficult time calibrating your model only based on data. Actually, what you're doing is you're making assumptions about the quality of the model, probably based on, well, does it satisfy the laws of physics? Does it encapsulate the kinds of behaviors that I understand? Was it produced by an expert in this system? And so these are much more social questions. These are, these are questions on which we can reasonably disagree. One person might say, I think this is important, and somebody else might say, no, I think that is important. And because there isn't any data in these extrapolatory regimes, there isn't any data to go back to and say, nope, she's right and he's wrong or whatever, then we have to then the assessment of confidence is done by discussion and by sort of consensus among a group of experts. And so I think that introduces the real social component to mathematical modeling when we're thinking about futures and we're thinking about going beyond the situation that we are familiar with and that we have data for.
You talk a lot about, in the book, you talk about assumptions and how the assumptions we make are literally the foundation of our models, right? And right now, in the energy sector, there's a lot of work being done around, getting to net zero. And getting to net zero requires all kinds of modeling being done. So talk a little bit about how do we avoid becoming trapped in our own assumptions and not taking other perspectives into our models? Because if you talk about consensus around the models, right? So right now, there are different views on how to get to net zero, different pathways being designed, but all of those things are based on assumptions. So talk about how do we avoid what you may call the trap of assumptions in terms of how we deal with models?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose the trap of assumptions is the trap of groupthink, really. There's nothing wrong with making assumptions, and we're going to have to make assumptions because the point of a model is to simplify. The point of a model, the value of a model is being able to simplify the situation, to be able to gain insights. It wouldn't be much use to just have a copy of the real world, because the whole point of making a model was to do something easier than the real world to be able to work with. And so we would like to be able to construct a model which is perfect, but we're going to make assumptions. I'm going to make some assumptions. You might have slightly different expertise and you might make slightly different assumptions. Somebody else might have completely different expertise and they might make completely different assumptions. And so the kind of trade-off is in saying, how far do we want to cast the net? Do we want to take the single person in the world who is deemed to be the most expert at this particular topic and take their assumptions to be perfect? Or do we want to try and spread that range a bit more widely? And I suppose my contention in the book is that it is really valuable to spread that range as widely as we can, because that will help us to understand these different perspectives on the situation and hopefully to end up in a situation where at least we have uncertainty ranges which overlap, rather than this unsatisfactory situation where different people making different models have uncertainty ranges which don't overlap, because that is a situation that tells us that we don't know what we're talking about and we're doing something wrong.
So one of the good things I like about these webinars is that the audience gets engaged immediately. And you mentioned different modelers. So here's a question from Tim, and I think it's relevant to what you just said. So as you wrote the book, he's asking, how many pairs, particularly those who have difference of opinion, did you engage to challenge your theses? And I know in the book, by the way, Tim, if you read the book, Erica takes on several individuals in terms of their views, including my good friend, who was at the former governor of the Bank of England, whose book Radical Uncertainty I also read. So talk a little bit about how you engage others who may have challenged your assumptions or your thesis about us needing to get from model land.
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose the book is a culmination of 10, 15 years of work on this topic. And I've had lots of discussions with people, from the very domain specific and focused environments. So for example, my work with the humanitarian agencies was really valuable in terms of sort of understanding the level of the kind of maybe the detachedness from models that some environments have, and that actually you really need to go back to first principles to understand how they can be useful and how to sort of lubricate the flow of information and generate more of a two-way dialogue rather than just saying, well, somebody goes away, here's the model, they pass it on to someone who hasn't got the foggiest idea how the model was constructed or what the output really means, but they're going to use the numbers because it has to go into a spreadsheet somewhere. So that was particularly enlightening for me. And then within the academic environment, I suppose I've had contact with philosophers. Philosophers are extremely argumentative. You can find various papers saying what terrible stuff I've written. So I've certainly engaged with them. And with, my core expertise is in weather and climate. And so, I've had long discussions over the last 10, 15 years with meteorologists, people working sort of more at the weather end, where we're talking about more data-driven models, and people more at the climate end of the spectrum, where we're talking about the more assumption-driven models. And of course, everything is pinned back to the laws of physics. But I think as Lawrence might mention, the chapter on weather and climate, I think, also shows that kind of engagement with differing ways of thinking about these kinds of questions.
We will come back to the chapter on weather and climate, but I want to go and take the question from Roger. Roger is asking, he actually asked two questions, but I think his first question was, how do you think about the balance of model results and the conclusions derived from sort of a broad experience, so to speak? And then his second question is, would you comment or care to comment how we were more comfortable with linear extrapolation and struggle with nonlinearity, which you address to some extent in the book? So first, talk about the first question as it relates to the issue.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I mean, you're jumping to the end, Roger, already, because this is kind of, I suppose, the point where I leave off with the book, is saying that that we have these sort of technical, more quantitative, more structured, I'm not going to use the word objective because I don't think they're objective, but more structured conclusions from models. And then we have the possibility of somebody might read the book and say, oh, we should throw them all out. They're all useless. These models are all contingent on expert judgment, and I don't trust the experts anyway. And why do they, if what they're doing is just encapsulating their expert judgment into a mathematical object, why should I have any trust in it? Well, I think there is a question to be answered there about expertise and what we mean by expertise. I think that, ultimately, I'm not coming down on the side of saying that model results are different from intuition. Actually, there's certainly a risk of throwing out the model results and going back to, well, what they call GOBSAT, good old boys sat around a table, which is now, I think, good old boys sat in front of a computer. But and just going to the kind of completely intuitive system of mid-decision making, I think that would be a mistake. I think that'd be a huge mistake, because models, as I've emphasized already, are a system for collective decision making, sort of collective understanding, really, more than decision making necessarily, and for communicating and thinking through the possible consequences of different kinds of assumptions. So you can sit around a table with the model in front of you and say, what would happen if we changed that variable? What would happen if we changed that parameter? What about, haven't we missed this other thing, which I think is important? And so I think the models are extremely good facilitators, and we shouldn't be pitting them against intuition. We should say that models can be used as a supplement and a facilitator of human intuition, but we need to be careful not to somehow pit them against each other. And then your other question, Roger, was about linearity and non-linearity. Well, I mean, this is close to my heart. I think that humans are generally more comfortable with linearity, and we do struggle with non-linearity in any form, and especially the exponential curves. I don't know, I suppose models can help us to get to grips with different forms of relations. I mean, things like plotting things on a logarithmic scale rather than on a linear scale, as we've seen again over the last 3 years in the pandemic. The use of a logarithmic scale is a helpful visual aid, and that to some extent is a model, a very simple one, saying that that we can kind of put these orders of magnitude together and try to visualize them.
Well, one of the things, talking about linearity, I mean, we know from nonlinear system that you begin by linearizing the problem around a certain equilibrium, and you solve for that nonlinearity around that equilibrium, and then you sort of you expand it to get to other nonlinearities you may have sort of excluded from your model for simplicity. And we'll get back to the issue of simplicity. Let me tell the audience, because this is a member-only webinar, you are actually encouraged to ask questions vocally and directly. So if you use the function to raise your hand, I will call on you and you can ask your question directly to Dr. Thompson in case you don't want me to filter your question. So feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions, and we'll call upon you. So Erica, let's just talk about public policy. right? In the book, you talk about how, and this industry is very much sort of governed more or less by public policy making. Talk about the challenges we face when it comes to informing public policy using models. What are some of the things we need to be careful with? And what are some of the things we need to do to help us use models to inform public policy much better?
Well, I mean, that's a massive question, and it goes also beyond my expertise. But from the point of view of the kind of model policy making interface, that I mean, I suppose it's nice to think that we ought to require decision makers to have familiarity and hopefully some degree of expertise with models, but in practice that's really unrealistic. That's unlikely to happen. And so what we need is a well lubricated interface which has the dialogue and hopefully flow of people and flow of expertise and the kind of transfer of knowledge that goes beyond just the scientist kind of trotting up and saying, here's my model, throwing it over the fence to somebody who goes away and writes down the number. I think we need to have these more nuanced discussions about uncertainty, about the limitations of models. And so perhaps one of the things that my book is aiming to do is to equip the less technically inclined with a set of questions and a handle on this question about modeling, to be able to go in and not necessarily criticize the way that models are being made, but help to ask the right kind of questions to stimulate the kind of discussions that need to be happening there, to ensure that, for example, that the model that's been constructed is adequate for the purpose of informing the decision that's being made, and that it encapsulates the kind of values that the decision maker wants to prioritize in terms of how they go about solving whatever the problem is.
In the chapter on climate modeling, and we'll come back to that, but I just want to bring up the point regarding the things we do not include in models. And so you talk about, certain decisions that we make outside of model land require us to use our expert judgment. But that word expert in and of itself has an issue, because different experts may have a different interpretation of what the model is telling us. So what would you say to the audience here as they deal with models all the time? How do they not 100% rely on the data, but also use expert knowledge to help to fine tune the decision-making process? How important is that?
Okay, well, first I'd say we have to go back to that question of whether we're in an interpolatory regime or an extrapolatory regime. If we're in that interpolatory regime where you're kind of within the set of points that you already have, then you can be fully data driven, and the assumptions actually are not critical, because imagine a set of points and you could fit a line through them, or you could fit a curve, or you could fit something a bit wiggly. Actually, it still doesn't make a massive difference to what your prediction is going to look like for another point within that set. But when we go outside that range and you start going into the tails where your quadratic goes off up to infinity and your cubic goes down to minus infinity, you can imagine, and for more complicated models, you have a multi-dimensional surface going off to infinities in multiple dimensions. So it becomes much more important to understand what the assumptions are when you're in that regime. So the first step, I would say, is understanding where we are. Are we trying to model basically a basketball throw, and we can do it with respect to data? In which case, we don't really need to talk about the assumptions very much at all, because it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. You can go and leave it to your AI to do it. But if you're in that extrapolatory regime and you're going beyond the data domain that you've already experienced, then we need to be extremely careful about the assumptions. And that's when we need to be having a critical conversation about who is an expert, what kinds of expertise are relevant, and how we go about combining expert judgment when experts might, as you say, disagree about the relevant assumptions. And of course, if they do disagree, then we can say that we just don't know. There is a backstop of saying, actually, the model is not adequate for the purpose of informing this decision. We simply don't have information here because our error bars have blown up to infinity and minus infinity, and we just have no idea. And so for sort of, for social and political processes, that might be the case. Or we might be in a situation, for example, central banks, when they are making predictions of interest rates or inflation, actually their predictions of inflation are part of the system, and it influences what happens. If a central bank said there's going to be a recession next week, then sure enough, there will be a recession next week, regardless of what the fundamentals were like, because it's about confidence as well, and it's very much a social process. And so sort of understanding what kind of model you are making. Is it a purely predictive model, or is it a model which is really part of the system and shaping the system? I think that is the starting point, and then going to these discussions about expertise and what kinds of knowledge are relevant.
You talk about, I want to get into this point about risk and uncertainty. I mean, obviously, the energy industry, we make a lot of investment in critical infrastructure, and those investments are long-lived assets, so they'll be there for the long haul. And as we're making these investments, we always have to keep in mind the sort of the risk about the future and the uncertainty about the future. What have you learned? I mean, what have you gathered from your work, Erica, in terms of how do we sort of manage risk and uncertainty when we're dealing with models, specifically, energy system models, climate models? How do we deal with risk and uncertainty?
Yeah, well, I mean, to sort of start at the interpolatory end of the spectrum, the sort of the throw of the basketball, we can say that if we're in that situation, then a sensitivity analysis of the model is probably adequate, that we can perturb all of the parameters and say, we'll run it with lots of different input conditions, and then we'll draw a distribution over the outcomes, and that will kind of reasonably represent our uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future, from which we can generate an understanding of the physical or financial risk that's involved in making that decision. So in that situation, you sort of can do it. But if you're talking about infrastructure decisions, say a hydroelectric dam, and questions about rainfall in 2080, or you're interested in siting a power station at sea level, and what will the cooling be available, or is the sea level going to rise such that it becomes impossible to defend it? Then, or you're investing in fossil fuel infrastructure, and you want to say, what is the regulatory environment going to be like in 10 years' time? Is this going to be a stranded asset because it simply becomes illegal to be operating this? Well, these are much more extrapolatory, because they are harder to answer with respect to the data that we have. So we have so the sea level rise, for example, in the short term, then sea level rise is a data-driven question. And we can say that sea level is rising by approximately 3 millimeters per year for the next few years, and we expect that to be quite accurate. But when you're talking about sea level to 2100, if you're making a long-lived investment, then you are talking about much bigger uncertainties about the what will happen to the ice sheets in a changing climate, and what emissions trajectory we might be on, whether we will succeed in reducing global emissions or not. And so your risk profile looks completely different, and it becomes to some extent unquantifiable. It becomes something that you would manage maybe more with scenarios, or with thinking about things, vulnerability. Starting with the question of how can we make a decision which is robust to multiple outcomes, rather than necessarily trying to optimize. If we're in the data-driven regime, then we can optimize, but if we're in the assumption-driven regime, then we probably can't optimize.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things we do as an industry, besides providing electricity, we do a lot of engagement with our members, with our customers, right? I said members, but I meant customers. The utilities here, they work with their customers on a day-to-day basis. And one of the issues is almost trying to understand customer behavior. And I know, behavior analytics, behavior science, these are new attempts to model human behavior. And this is one of those things. I mean, obviously the book talks a little bit about, mathematical modeling of certain kinds of behavior. But when it comes to human behavior, any thoughts on how can we, or why we should be careful about mathematically modeling human behavior and making decisions based on those mathematical models of how humans will behave?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. There's a lot of reasons why we should be careful. So maybe to try and put them all together, I suppose the reason that we should be particularly careful is that the models are part of the system, and the models influence then how reality turns out, that to some extent in creating the model, we are influencing what reality is going to look like, because we're making assumptions that then feed back. For example, there's Cathy O'Neill's famous example from her book, Weapons of Mass Destruction, about reoffending rates, that if you make a model, an algorithm which assigns people to categories based on their physical characteristics and their data about them, then that can be extremely discriminatory, and it kind of is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it makes assumptions about people which then influence the way that they are treated and the way that they will then act in future. So there are questions like that about sort of harms of making assumptions about what people will do, which kind of negate their free will in a sense. It doesn't give them the option to be anything other than a statistic, and I think that is a real harm. And then sort of wider scale questions about human behavior. I mean, for example, what kind of cost do we put on behavior change to reduce energy use, energy demand over the next 20 or 50 years? Well, do we start with a model that says that energy demand is kind of non-negotiable, and that we want to be able to flick a switch whenever we can to switch on anything we possibly might want to? Or do we say that the consumer as a citizen is involved in this system, and that they are part of the system and they have to take some responsibility for their demand changes? And how do you motivate that? Do you motivate that in a social way, or do you motivate it in a financial way by having flexible tariffs? There are loads of different ways of thinking about this, I suppose. And then the point is that the kind of model that you choose, if you put in place a financial model versus a sort of moral appeal to good citizenship, that will change the way that the humans in the system interact with the model, and the kinds of things that they try to do in response, whatever interventions you're trying to make. So I suppose this comes back to the point that we were discussing earlier about how models create, models really feed back and they create, and they are part of the imaginative process of thinking about what the future will look like, and pushing it in certain directions, because they shape the way that we think, and they shape the kinds of things that we think are possible.
So I want to talk a little bit about AI. AI and the role of AI, obviously, in the book.
Everybody's got to talk about AI these days.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a question from Tim about AI and how AI can help in terms of the blind spots. But AI can actually also create blind spots. But in the book, let me read a passage from the book here where you talk about artificial intelligences are not good at robust decision making. Without a human in the loop, they cannot exercise flexibility to account for unanticipated events or assign new value judgments to reflect a changing situation. And then you're right. For this reason, I think it is important that we don't rush to automate all decisions that were previously made by humans, or ossify certain models into inflexible decision-making procedures. Let's talk, that's a big statement, but it's a powerful statement, which says, how should we engage with AI? And as an industry, we're being bombarded with, chat GPT and the next, right? How should we think about AI in terms of modeling, and how should we do what you say in the book, not automate all decisions, but make sure we have the human input into the process?
Yeah, okay. So I think ChatGPT is maybe a good example to start with, because the question, again, that we have to start with is, what is it for? Okay, so what kind of decision are we trying to inform with it? And if you say, well, I'm looking to search on the internet for, I don't know, like a house plant with red leaves and long stems, or whatever, so something specific to which there is an answer, right? So the data, the answer is contained within the training set. Then the AI will do a fantastic job. The AI will be probably more efficient at doing this than you can be. It will present it in the way that you want it. It's incredibly powerful. If you're interested in, using AI to model energy demand sort of over the day or something like that, it probably will do really well in picking up patterns and relationships that you might not have noticed. So it can be extremely good in that data-driven regime where we have lots of data and we're not trying to go beyond it. But if you want to ask ChatGPT, you know, what will be the 30 most important inventions of the next 50 years, well, it will bullshit you. It will bullshit you very effectively. It will give you a credible sounding answer, but it's not based on expertise. It's not something that you can kind of interrogate in terms of where its information is coming from and where it is genuinely just bullshitting you. It's not it is not thinking, right? It's just using its data to come up with a plausible answer. So if you are trying to answer a question for which the answer is not contained within the training data, then AI is a very bad approach and we shouldn't use it, because what it needs is imagination. We need to be able to go beyond our training set of data. Now, I mean, I could be slightly more nuanced than that and say that actually that's not necessarily a absolute fundamental limitation, because, for example, you know, we hope that by observing the past, we don't just infer a set of relationships between data, we infer a set of laws of physics, and we are highly confident that the laws of physics will continue. I mean, this is a value judgment, but it's one that hopefully most of us would share. You know, if I ask this audience whether they think the acceleration due to gravity is going to change tomorrow, or the speed of light is going to change tomorrow, or the value of pi is going to change tomorrow, well, it's not. Of course it's not. And we can all agree on that. So it's not fundamentally impossible for AI to learn these more basic relationships and then propagate that through into a sensible understanding of what the future would look like, in the same way as human experts do. But I think what it can't do effectively is to give you a clear understanding of how these representations embody value judgments. So if we say, you know, we are using it to imagine a different future. We are using it as a sort of cognitive prosthetic to think about what the future might look like, and then we want to choose the good futures. Well, just the word good. How is the AI going to know what is good? We have to program it. We have to tell it. We have to give it an objective function. We have to give it a function to minimize or maximize, and then it will do that. But it's not able to make its own judgments about what is good. And so I think, you know, as politics changes and as society changes, our values change as well. And if we've written down the values, you know, we wouldn't want to have written down the values of 1943 and have them still be dictating to us in 2023. Things do change, and we should be able to incorporate those. And I think one of the dangers of AI is that we sort of just implicitly write down all of these value systems, which aren't even necessarily shared by all of the population at the moment, but they are certainly not necessarily shared by people in the future. So having the ability to question and criticize and adapt to those, I think, is really important.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm going to come back and talk briefly about the climate model, but I think Roger has a question. He's raised his hand. Roger, Elika is going to unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your question directly. Go ahead, Roger.
Hi, Erica.
Hello.
Thank you very much. I love your expression of ChatGPT bullshitting you, because it'll give you a sort of beautifully worded answer that's complete nonsense.
Yeah, exactly.
So the question is, and this is a failing of, I live in the world of models and policy and all that sort of, this is a failing of maybe both models as well as intuition. And I think that the term is called, black swan event. And sort of some of your, based on your research, some thoughts, advice, counsel, and sort of dealing with that.
Yeah, okay, sure. Black swans. I mean, I think that most black swans were not in principle unpredictable or unforecastable. I mean, it tends to be that there is a blind spot, and the black swan event that might happen, actually, if you'd asked a more diverse set of people to begin with, you would have constructed a model which had wider uncertainty ranges and was able to countenance the possibility of that particular black swan occurring. I mean, of course, there'll always be the occasional thing which is totally outside the range of previous observations and conceptual possibility, but I think that's pretty rare. I think in general, black swans arise from us being overconfident, and being overconfident because we think that we have quantified everything when we actually haven't. And so I think that models are, you know, the kind of overconfidence in models and this tendency to push the uncertainty ranges as narrow as they possibly can go it kind of encourages black swans, because it makes us feel more confident and forget to think about those tails. We forget to think about, well, what could happen if the model is wrong? So we need more, you know, it's not to say that everything can be incorporated within the model, but to be able to have processes which are able to acknowledge that the model is not always going to be right, and say, and have a risk, a kind of risk register, I suppose, which can say, what happens if the model is wrong? What's the worst thing that might happen, and how would we deal with it?
Erica, let's talk a little bit about, based on that question from Roger, let's talk about the part of the book where you talk about accountability gap. Because I think when models fail, well, when models work, the modelers take credit. Excellent forecast. When models fail, everyone then goes silent, right? You gave the example of the forecaster in London who said there wasn't going to be a hurricane, and then 28 people, I think, lost their lives. We saw the election in different parts of the world where the forecasters were wrong, but they will have never come back and said they were wrong. There's always a new reason, and after the fact justification as to why the forecast was wrong. How do we handle the issue of accountability, especially since everything we do in this world today is based on models? Who's accountable when the models are wrong? And how do we sort of apply that accountability when we have complex models? Say, like, for example, the IPCC projections. If they're wrong, who do you blame? How do we go about doing that? How do we do accountability?
Yeah, I feel that this is really problematic, and certainly one of the things that I wanted to highlight in my book, that you know, that by making models and then kind of imbuing them with this perhaps false sense of confidence, we lose the accountability, because you know, the decision maker can say, well, we were following the science, we must follow the science. Of course, we must always follow the science. Well, you know, the science has its limitations. The science is not telling us the whole truth, and it is not telling us everything that we need to know, and there are always things that are outside of what it's able to do. So yeah, I do feel concerned that we have these kind of chameleon models, as I think the economist Paul Fleiderer put it, that when you're kind of selling the model, you know, a company comes to you to sell you a fancy model that will give you the details of your, I don't know, your wind farm yields over the next 20 years or something. You know, that when they're selling it to you, it's a fantastic model and it can do everything, all singing, all dancing, all bells and whistles. But when something goes wrong and you say, actually, hang on a minute, you know, it didn't check out, it wasn't right. You go back and they say, well, look at the small print, you know, we never claimed it was going to do that, it's only a model. And I think this is pervasive, right, when we use models, but you can see it in the gap between policy and modeling in COVID-19 pandemic decision making. You know, you say, oh, well, you know, we did this because of the models, but the models say, oh, we weren't perfect, and you know, there were lots of caveats and there was lots of uncertainty, and you should have realized that. As for what you do about this, I don't know. I think it is a tricky question. I think that you know, escaping from model land is one of the answers, is getting the modelers to make specific quantitative judgments about the degree to which their model represents reality. So in some circumstances, you can do that with respect to data, and then everybody can be confident. But if you can't, then you can ask your modelers to give you expert judgment ranges based on the model output of what they think reality will look like. So a good example of this is the IPCC, where they generate their headline ranges from the 90% confidence interval of models, but they don't say that's a 90% confidence interval for the real world. They flatten it out a bit and say that's only a 66% confidence interval for the real world outcome. And I think, you know, that's helpful, because it's a specific, you know, accountable to some extent, transparent judgment about the relationship of the model with reality. And so getting, I think, more modelers to be comfortable with making those judgments, and it is difficult, you know, completely understand that it's not comfortable for modelers to be making these judgments, and that actually then you run into legal questions about liability if they're making these personal judgments, which by definition are outside of model land, and then kind of by definition are outside the things that they have generated quantitatively and systematically. So to some extent it is just somebody putting a finger in the air and writing down a number. So what's the liability for that? What's the accountability for that? I mean, that raises difficult questions. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that would help. I think that would help the decision maker, because it shouldn't be left to the decision maker to try to assess the quality of the model. The modeler is the one coming with the domain expertise and able to do that.
And I think this is so important, because right now, as the energy sector is being sort of asked to transition to net zero, utilities, like I said on this call, many of them have already made net zero plans. They have an energy transition plan. But what's interesting is that for the longest time, a lot of the work around pathways, people would say using the McKinsey model. Now, so if I use the McKinsey model to design my pathway, and I would love to hear some of the folks on this call, maybe Roger and others who comment, but if I use a certain model to design my pathway and something goes wrong further down, do I come back and blame that institution? How should we as an industry tackle the issue that many of the models we're using were not developed by us? They were sort of thrown to us and say, go and use this, right? Should we be questioning these models more? What language should we use to escape from model land? What's the language?
Yeah,
What tools
I mean, well, I suppose I mean, maybe I start by saying I have a deep skepticism about these somewhat non-expert management consultancies coming in and telling the experts how to do it. And actually, the reason that that industries are willing to pay such large amounts of money for, not models that are not necessarily any better than they could do in-house is precisely because of this, that you're paying for that sort of loss of accountability, and to be able to say, actually, it wasn't my decision. And so the value really is not the model that's provided, but the ability to be able to say it was someone else that told me to do it. And I mean, that raises other questions about whether that's a good thing or not. If we take it at face value and say, yes, they're providing these models and we are buying them in good faith because we want the information, then yes, I think we should be specifically asking about getting out of model land and saying, what is your judgment? Can you give me a sort of verifiable forecast about what you expect to happen and why, and we'll come back in 5 years and we'll check. And then when we talk about the longer term, actually, if we're talking about 20 years or 50 years ahead, then what you're doing with a model is not making a prediction anyway, per se. I don't think. What you're doing with a model is generating a kind of imaginative construction of what a future might look like. So you mentioned companies' transition plans and net zero. I think nobody would believe that we can make a credible prediction of what's going to happen on the scale of these net zero transition plans, but by having one, it's the sort of plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. By having a plan and by kind of setting that direction of travel and setting the value system and the overarching priorities which will guide your decision making on a smaller scale in the future, then I think that is incredibly valuable. And it's not valuable because of its predictive success. It's valuable because of its kind of imaginative agenda setting role.
Yeah, I know Roger wanted to come up, but before he does, I just want to make a point that the reason I raised the issue, Erica, is because those sort of future planning documents, if you may, actually influence your investors, right? So in a sense, there is a financial dimension to it. Roger, you had a comment regarding this issue around, how we deal with some of the difficulties of using models that are not created within house.
Yeah, I think you kind of invited me to jump in on this one. So one of the ways I would think of it is, being careful to go too far in the blame direction, because one of the values of models, et cetera, is sort of continuous learning. I think you do have a point that management should not obfuscate their responsibility by bringing someone in and calling them an expert. I definitely agree with that. And then it leads me to sort of another thought that might be very controversial is, similar to statistics, models can be used for essentially propaganda or forwarding sort of an outcome that you want. Some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, completely. Not controversial at all. Not around here. Yeah, absolutely. The model, the model shapes the way that we think. You choose a model, and in doing so, you set your priorities. The variables that you represent in the model are the ones that you deem to be important, and that's a value judgment. And somebody else might make a different model by incorporating different things. If we look at the COVID models and their focus on mortality rates and hospitalization, nobody would argue that that wasn't important, but a lot of people would argue that there were many other things that were also important and that ended up being downrated as a result of the models focusing on those particular variables. So completely, net zero transition plans, when you decide what to include and what not to include, or just, a financial framework. If we say we have a financial framework whereby we expect to take a cost optimal pathway to 2050 or 2100, that implies that the no policy solution is the cost optimal solution, and that any technically, that if we're making any perturbations to that by adding additional constraints, that it will be financially costly. I don't think that's necessarily the case at all in the case of climate change, for example, but the way that we formalize things into a model make these kind of assumptions for us. So you're completely right. It's absolutely the way that we choose to make models in these extrapolatory kind of future-facing regimes very much determine how we think about them and the kinds of things we do and that we think we can do, and that's political. Yes.
Yeah, and the thing is, we bring our biases to the models when we design the models.
Absolutely.
We bring our judgments, we bring our prejudice. These are all things that affect the model. Listen, Erica, we have about 3 minutes left. I want to just quickly talk about the complexity of climate modeling, and I want to come to page 175 in your book. And for those who haven't read the book, 10 chapters, easy read. I recommend you get the book. We can't cover everything on this call. So you're right, and I want you to talk about it. You said failures of imagination, and you say the failure of most wealthy countries to address climate change ultimately represents an immense failure of imagination. And this failure of imagination has been compounded by the unimaginative ways in which science makes and interprets mathematical models. What are some of the failures of imagination that you think is holding us back from addressing not just climate change, but all the other issues we're facing? Climate change, global poverty, and all these other issues, supply chain issues. What's wrong with the imagination? How can we fix it?
Yeah, okay. So I think that comes back to Roger's question that follows on quite nicely. It's it's the same kinds of things. It's saying that the model is encapsulating our value system and our ideas about how the future might happen. And if we take, for example, a financial model that says that we are going to minimize costs, then that is what we will do. But is that really the right thing to do? Do financial values encapsulate all of the things that we believe to be important about the future? Well, I would certainly argue that they don't. It's not necessarily the case that they can't. We could, in principle, put financial values on everything. But if you read that section of my book, I also talk about the incommensurability of many of these things. Does it make sense to subtract air quality outside a school from I don't know, the impact on livelihoods in sub-Saharan Africa? Like, how can you reasonably put those onto a one-dimensional scale and subtract them and then optimize them? Well, the whole idea of making a model and quantifying and putting things into a single framework and then generating a scalar which we can optimize, I think that is in some respects problematic and limiting to our imagination, because it prevents us from thinking more holistically about the kinds of trade-offs that we might make and the interests of different people, and to be able to integrate different value systems. People may have different ways of valuing different outcomes, and that in principle can't be done within a single model. Maybe we can do it with multiple models. So perhaps the overarching message on that theme is that we need many models constructed by many different people and embodying their different value judgments. And then we can see where the outcomes are robust and we all agree, and then we can go ahead and do those things. And we can see where actually the politics and the social aspects and the value judgments are actually more important. And then we have to go away and have a conversation about the politics first before we start doing the modeling.
Well, listen, Erica, this has been a fascinating conversation. Again, the book is A Skip from Model Land. Erica, you've done an excellent job in condensing all this material, all this work into this book. My last question to you is, coming back, the last paragraph in the book, you say, the whole concept, and I'm asking this question because our industry, we're making a lot of investments to deal with all the issues around climate and everything from the infrastructure, clean energy transition. The power sector is there. We are at the forefront. We're doing a lot of investments. But here's a very interesting way you end the book, or you end that chapter. You say, the whole concept of predicting the future can sometimes end up reducing the possibility of actively creating a better one. If we want the future to look different from the present and not just a continuation of all of today's trends, then we have to construct models that are able to imagine something more. What final advice of world would you give us, the audience here from the electric industry? What should we do more in terms of trying to imagine that cleaner world, that cleaner energy future we're working towards?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's be creative, think about what we're working towards rather than what we're working away from. And perhaps, we're working away from blackouts, and we're working away from climate change, and we're working away from, high costs and inflation and all of these other things. But actually, I think it's helpful to have in mind what we're working towards when we're generating models and thinking about what do we, if we could imagine a utopia, what would we want the future of energy supply or the future of whatever to look like, and I think that's a helpful challenge. Maybe you end up compromising and you go back to something which looks more like the models you've already had, but having that in the back of your mind as you proceed, I think, is always helpful.
Well, listen, Erica, congratulations again on A Skip from Model Land. A very interesting book to read in the summer if you have nothing else to do. If you're in the Western Hemisphere, if you're in Australia, New Zealand, you can still read this in the winter as well, because it will really get your thought going as to how we should go about dealing with the world. So thanks again for joining us, Erica. And again, thanks to everybody for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you in the next EI International Programs webinar. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. And thank you everyone for coming.